Just keeping an eye. We have Terry joining us as well now. So welcome, Terry. Okay, Terry, you're muted at the moment. Please feel free to unmute yourself. What I'd like to do, we've got a 40-minute session today. And so what I'd like to do is to give you a brief overview of how Qigong and mental health work together, probably about 10 minutes. Then have about 20 minutes of practice so that we can look at how we can take a very simple practice in order to help our mental health. And then have 10 minutes at the end for questions and for general conversation if there are no questions, because I think there's it's always an interesting area, and it always creates conversation. So I guess the first thing I'd like to say is I was talking to some of my Chinese teachers because obviously my practice is Qigong, and the Chinese teachers that I was talking to were very highly respected, and I said to them, what can you do for Qigong around mental health? And they said nothing. And I was like, oh, okay, that wasn't quite the answer I was expecting, because at this point I'd been working with people with significant mental health issues for a few years. So I asked them what they meant by, you know, nothing, why we couldn't work with people with mental health issues. And it turns out that their translation of mental health really pushed into the areas such as psychosis, schizophrenia, the more significant, or the more extreme mental health issues. And actually having the conversation with them, they weren't saying you can't use it, they were saying you have to use it very carefully. But that caused a problem for me, partly because I'd been working around mental health with Qigong and getting some interesting results for a few years. And the other reason is that if you look at the practice of Qigong, we have a saying that sits within it, which is Yi Dao, Qi Dao, which is Mandarin. Yi Dao is where the mind goes, Qi Dao, the Qi goes. We'll come to the question of what is Qi in a minute. So there's almost this link saying that within Qigong, what we're doing is we're working with the mind. And surely mental health must have to do with the mind, otherwise it wouldn't be called mental health. So how can you turn around and say that sort of the mind-based practices, the body-mind-based practices, can't be used for mental health? Of course they are. The question really that sits with this for me is, what do you perceive your mental health to be? What do you want your mental health to look like? Everybody has mental health, the same as everybody has physical health. And on different days, our physical health may be better and mental health may be better. It's not a good or a bad, it's just a state of health. And we create this strange division between the physical and the mind. So what I'm interested in here is what is your idea of mental health? And that's rhetorical. I'm not looking for an answer. It's really just this idea of, if you think of your best version of mental health, what does it look like? So that's the question of mental health. That's done, right? We can move that one on. I can talk about this for a very long time, so I'm going to try to keep it quite abridged. And the second thing is this question about what is Qigong and why is it good for mental health? Now, I did a talk to the Integrative Health Convention, which is a group of medical practitioners in the UK who are interested in complementary therapies. This was last year, and I did a talk about stress, and I put the question up, why is Qigong good for stress? And my answer had to be, it's not. It's not about the tool being good. It's about how the tool is used. You could equate it to, you know, the best way to get from one end of the UK to the other is by car. So get a car. But you need to know how to drive it. You need to know how to use it in order to make it effective. It's the same with Qigong. So what I'd like to do is to explore one of the fundamental pieces within Qigong that helps to point towards how we can use this for mental health. Joyce, you have your hand up.
I'm not clear. I'm having trouble hearing. What is the word you're saying?
It's Qigong.
Can you spell it for me? I've never heard of it.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll put it up on the on a whiteboard on here, and so we can. Right. So if
Okay.
I just so we can see it here, which is
Qigong.
Qigong.
Okay. Thank you.
Now I'm just wondering if I can't appear to delete that. So, oh, let me try that one. So,
okay.
So Qigong is also sometimes spelt Chikung as well. One of them is the Chinese version, the QI is the Chinese version, the CHI is the westernized version. So, yeah, so the question then really is, what is Qigong? So Qigong I consider to be best looked at from the point of view of what is Qi. This idea of Qi. And Qi gets, if you ask normally, what you find is people talk about vital energy, life force, things like this, which is good, it's fine, but it's not that accessible. If you look at the idea of what Qi is within Chinese culture, what you find is you go back to about 250 BC and the character for Qi is just 3 lines. And these 3 lines denote vapor rising to form clouds. So this is also unhelpful. It's difficult to get our heads around what that means. But what it's really talking about is Qi is a category of invisible forces that create change. So any invisible force that creates change would be called Qi. So if you think of the ocean without wind, it would be flat calm. You can't see wind, therefore wind is Qi. You can't see electric running through cables, but it creates change. Therefore electricity, by this definition, is Qi. We've already mentioned this Yi-Dao, Qi-Dao, where the mind goes, the Qi follows, or the British equivalent would be if you put your mind to it. This implies that there's something invisible going on with the mind. So this falls into this category of Qi. So having said that, there's an idea that sits within this, that by itself, Qi does nothing. It's just the potential for change. It needs direction. So I'm sort of whistling through things quite quickly here. But this really helps us to point towards why Qigong is such a useful thing for mental health and developing the mind. Because the thing that Qi links to is information. Okay, so when I'm talking about information, I think you then need to ask the question, what is information? Information is that life-changing book that you've never read. It's the amazing thing on television that you've never watched. Information is just information. Until you read the book or until you watch the program on television, it's just information. It doesn't do anything. So what I'm saying is that within the practice of Qigong, what we're interested in is, what is our information? What are we working with? And if you look at issues around mental health, if you're talking about issues around anxiety, if you're talking about all these types of things, this question becomes interesting. What is the information that you're working with? If you're talking about anxiety, what are you worrying about? If you're talking about stress, what are you stressing about? If you're talking about any number of these types of things, look at what's behind it. And that really helps you to understand where it's coming from. And now at that point, I want to tell you a story about a guy that I worked with about 6 or 7 years ago in a local town. And this guy, he was the only person I'd ever met who felt dangerous. Now, I've been in some really threatening situations. I've worked with the military in Saudi Arabia. I've been in all kinds of strange places, but I'd never met anybody who felt dangerous like he did. And he introduced himself by saying, I live my life by 3 words: hate, kill, and destroy. He then went on to talk about his love of martial arts, his love of weapons. I was working with a social worker who described him as the only unmasked psychopath she'd ever met. He was quite an alarming guy. And he spoke about the voices in his head and what they were telling him to do. And so I was saying, you know, hi, I'm John, I teach Qigong, making sure I was nearer to the door than he was, and trying to understand what I could work with. And there was a moment in this conversation that he was describing the voices in his head, and he was saying that it's like this person who he identified, like this person is shouting in my ear. So I turned around to him and I said, what would it be like if the person was standing further away? And he paused and looked at me and he said, what do you mean? Everybody tells me I've got to get rid of the voices in my head. Why, you know, are you saying I don't have to get rid of the voices in my head? And I was like, well, yeah. Why would you want to get rid of the voices in your head? But to have the opportunity to notice what they're saying before you respond to them, wouldn't that be useful? And it blew him away. I don't think I was the only person that had said that to him. I think I was the first person who had been able to say it in a time that he was willing to hear it. And I gave him a practice, and the practice was a practice we'll play with today, which is Lachi, which is expand out and gather back. It's a very simple practice. And gave him the idea, well, because he'd spoken about his martial arts, I asked him the question of, do you ever punch anybody on the in-breath? And you don't. That is always an out-breath. Do you ever say something to somebody on the in-breath? You don't. It's always the out-breath. You always have an in-breath before an action. So if you take that moment of in-breath to just take a moment to get a bit more perspective, what you do is you create the opportunity to have a different response. Shared that with the practice, and off he went. I joke that if I smoked at that point, I'd have probably gone out and smoked a whole 40, because it was a difficult situation to be in. But then 3 months later, I had a call from the manager of the centre that I've been working at saying, you won't believe who's just come in. I was just like, okay, what's happened? And he said, the guy who came in, and he described him, he said, he's just come in to say thank you. I was like, okay, what's that about? He said, well, he's no longer alcohol dependent, he's no longer drug dependent, he's no longer homeless, and he's employed. And he came in not to say thank you for doing it for him. He came in to say thank you for the idea and for giving him the technique to do it for himself. The thing that's interesting here is that he didn't try to get rid of the thing that was the problem. He created the space to notice what it was and to choose a more apt response to it. So although mental health is a complex piece, and we can talk at length about different aspects, why Qigong can be dangerous around mental health, and I fully believe that Qigong can be dangerous around mental health. But this idea is core. If we can create the space to notice what our responses are, to give ourselves a bit of a moment to actually take a breath, see what's going on, we give ourselves the opportunity to respond in a different way. We give our mind the opportunity to actually notice things or to work with things in a different way. I sometimes use the jam jar analogy. And the jam jar analogy is, if somebody hands you a jam jar because they can't open it, what they're asking you to do isn't take the lid off, they're asking you to loosen it enough so that you can take the lid off. This is what that space does. It loosens the lid of the jam jar enough that you can then take it off in your own time and go, what is this that's going on? So this is the idea I'd like to work with today. How can we create a little bit of space? How can we create a little bit of perspective when things are going on for us? So, are there any questions at that point before we dive into some practice? Wow. I've either explained that really clearly, or I've completely baffled you or bored you to tears. So,
now, having done a couple of your sessions already, that makes sense to me. So perhaps that's why I don't need to ask any questions.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback. Okay, so let's try a little bit of Qigong. And I'm going to try to flip across to another camera here. There we go. Now, I prefer to do my Qigong standing, but you can do this seated. You can even do these practices lying down. But just for today, I'll be using this camera and I'll be standing. So, unfortunately, I've got a very small image of myself in the corner of the screen. So hopefully, if I hold my hands up, yeah, it looks like you see all of me. And unfortunately, because of the time of day, I've got this shaft of light behind me, which makes it look somewhat ethereal, and it's really not meant to. Okay, so the first thing that I'm interested in Qigong is how do we get into what we call the Qigong state? And then the second thing that I'm interested in is what can we do once we're there? So, what I mean by the Qigong state is when the body is relaxed. When the body relaxes, the mind has a chance to quieten. And when the mind is quietened, it has the space to notice things and create a little bit more space between input and response. So to start with, we're just creating this Qigong state. So find a comfortable posture. And what I mean by comfortable posture is a posture that the breath travels freely. So within Qigong, we tend to talk about breathing into the small of the back, but if you already have a breathing practice, you can use this idea of how can I breathe down into the abdomen, wherever you want to go. But from a Qigong perspective, what we'll use something called kidney breathing. So if you put the hands on the small of your back, so if you can put the palms on, that's great. If you can put the back of the hands on, that's great. If only one hand goes, that's no problem. Whatever works for you today. And as you breathe, what I'd like you to do is notice that part of the body. Now you may be able to allow that part of the body to move. You may notice that part of the body move with the breath. So what I'm interested in is how can I stand in a way that helps that part of the body move, that helps the breath travel freely. So we can make little adjustments. So if you lock the knees, you'll tend to find that that stops the breath traveling quite so freely. So soften the knees. You may find foot position is interesting. So sometimes people stand with their toes pointing out. You may find that's easier, you may find it's more difficult. Find a posture that helps the breath travel here to the small of the back. And then once the hands have been there for a little while, you may find that that place has warmed up. Take the hands away and breathe to the warm patch on your back. This is a really nice little trick. If you take the breath down into the small of the back, you actually give yourself a little bit of a rest. You give yourself a bit of space. So it's a technique that you can use just by itself. But as a way to come into a Qigong practice, it's a central part. So mobilize the neck, soften the neck, and no specific. We're creating space in the neck. That's all we're doing. And when you've opened up some space in the neck, you squeeze the mid-spine. And if you release the shoulder blades forward, you can open the mid-spine. So just squeezing and opening. squeezing. We can also notice the lumbar spine, and here a nice technique, allowing the body to turn one side to the other. So it hasn't got to be a big movement, but we're trying to do this with keeping the hips fairly stationary at the moment. It's almost absent-minded. It's just shifting from one side to the other, very relaxed. Once we've done a few of these, we can let go of the idea of the hips being stationary. We can just allow the body to move one side to the other. So the whole body relaxed, shifting the weight from one foot to the other, turning slightly. And here, as we do this, the movement can change. It can always alter. We can notice how the ankles are soft. We can notice the knees are soft. Notice how the hips are mobile. And then come back into a centered position. So just to come, so the body can still move freely, but see how that feels. We can take this up a level again. So this time, if you lift the hands up and so they face the earth, on the out-breath, imagine connecting down into the earth. And on the in-breath, imagine drawing up into the center of the abdomen, lower dantian. Expanding out and gathering back. Expanding out and gathering back. This by itself, again, a very useful technique if you feel as if your head is too full, if you've got too many thoughts going on, if you're in that anxious state. Sometimes this movement that just pushes down through the balls of the feet, it brings the awareness as far away from the head as is possible in the body. It's everything. Okay, so then we can try another movement. So the next time the hands are in front of the abdomen, we can lift the hands up and imagine connecting up through the top of the head into the blue sky, and then drawing the blue sky down through the spine, which is open and relaxed, into the abdomen, into the center of lower dantian. So in your own time, connecting up into blue sky, creating space in the body, drawing blue sky back down into the body. A couple more times. Connecting up and gathering down. Connecting up and gathering down. Next time the hands are in front of the abdomen, allow them to pause here. And the elbows, open the wrists, open the arms, and we can imagine expanding out in all directions and gathering back from all directions. So this is Lachi, this is the practice I mentioned. So here we're expanding out, we're letting go, we're creating space, creating that moment that when we come back inside, we can then notice what it feels like inside. So expanding out into blue sky in all directions. Gathering back inside. So we're using all of the body, so connecting out through the feet and the top of the head, out in all directions. And gather back. Expanding out. and gather back. Okay, so I'd like to just use some subtle changes to this as we're expanding out and gathering back. Feels like if you draw the feet a little closer together. Still the idea of expanding out into blue sky and drawing blue sky back inside. Creating that little bit of space. Then what I want you to do is, without the body moving, remember the thing I said at the beginning, Idao, Qidao, where the mind. So we can just use the breath. That breath is connecting out into the blue sky. The in-breath draws blue sky back inside. Just following the breath, connecting out into blue sky, bringing blue sky back inside. A few more times with just the breath. And then the next time in, draw the hands back in. We bring the hands back into play. So gathering into, we refer to lower dantian, this space in front of the spine. And then expand out in all directions. But you could just bring the hands in towards the center of the chest, the heart. Wherever you want to draw into and expand out from. A very simple practice. Now the nice thing is that we can use this idea anywhere and for any length of time. So how many of these breaths, how many of these movements does it make to make a difference? And I would say one. If we simply relax the hands to the sides, quiet, and then just one breath, out into blue sky, and back in. If we can get into the habit of having that idea and that softness of breath, what we do is we have the ability to allow the whole body to relax and the mind to quieten. So we normally put all of our chi to, all the things we worry about, all the stuff that weighs heavy. In that one moment, we can soften our grip on it. It's still there, but in that moment, you don't need to worry about it. In that moment, it's just information. Okay. With the idea of simple. If we've been in the La Chi practice, standing out and gathering back, there is a rule. I don't go with rules that much, but there is a rule. And the rule here is that you need to come back inside. So at the end, relax the hands inside, open them in front of you, gather, and draw the hands back. And one hand rests on top of the other hand, and it rests on the belly. And the idea here is that we've brought the mind back into lower dantian. And the mind is resting in lower dantian. The body is full of chi. It's full of this untapped potential. It's full of this invisible force that can create change, but the mind which drives the chi is relaxed. We're just taking a moment back inside. Then we can relax the hands to the side. Okay. So, a question then, as we're coming into sort of the last 10 minutes of this session. How was that? And is that something you feel you could use?
Yeah, very calming.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the Parkinson's is all about the non-motor issues. That's me personally. So my inability to deal with stress or anxiety at any level dominates my life. So I'm doing your sessions, I'm doing shiatsu. I'm trying to just develop a calmer way of dealing with the everyday. So this just settles me and just calms me down. Very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel as if you could take that and work with it by yourself outside of the sessions?
I do.
Brilliant.
I do.
Okay, wonderful. Anybody else got anything coming up for them?
Hey, John, my name's Rita. I'm Terry's wife. I've been doing it with him as well.
Hi.
I was wondering, do you have like videos that you do or provide or like online with this? I can see how it could be very helpful.
Yeah, on the PCS UK Exercise Hub, so on the Facebook page, there will be some videos being released over the next week or so. And one of them is a video on La Chi, which is this practice. There are some others which are sort of fuller exercise sets. But yeah, there are resources there. But having said that, I would encourage you to play with it yourself. Because it's always good to have a shared experience of the practice. It's always good to have the guidance.
Mm-hmm.
But actually the place that it makes the most difference is when it's really working there in your everyday life. There was a lady who came to me a couple of years ago. She's a psychotherapist by trade, and she'd been to see her supervisor, who's also training in Qigong. And her supervisor said to her, evidently, that unless you do Qigong for 2 hours a day, you're wasting your time. And she came along and looked, and she was genuinely upset by this. And she said, "What's your opinion of it?" And I said, "I think you ought to go back to your supervisor and ask her how she expects to get good results by only practicing Qigong for 2 hours a day. Surely we should be doing this all the time. These simple breathing techniques, these ideas that we're working with, they should be there in every moment. You know, going and putting the kettle on, going and doing a chore, walking, any of these moments, we've got time to take one of these breaths. And if it becomes a habit, then what the habit does is it means that at all points during our life, we can gain a little bit of perspective, create a little bit of space. And the expert on your life is you. The person who knows where to create the space is you. So please come and join in the practice sessions. And there's a practice session every Wednesday at 4 that we do. But the trick is to take the practices and work with them and do something great for yourself. So climbing off soapbox. I hope that was helpful.
Do you see that, but what you start with one in the morning, like just to kind of start your day and then try to incorporate it throughout the day is the plan, or? Yeah.
I personally, I mean, I'm a full-time Qigong person. So I will start the morning with a physical practice to wake the body up. Then I will have then practice happens during the day. It may not be formal practice.
Right.
We haven't had any rain here really for a couple of months, so I'm out watering the garden a lot. So watering the garden can be practice. Walking the dogs can be practice. And then in the evening, the practice is a lot quieter so that you really quieten the mind down so that you can sleep more easily. So the simple rule is in the morning, you do something bigger to wake yourself up. You maintain a level that makes sense to you during the day, and in the evening, you do something quiet to quieten yourself down.
Okay.
And we can make this horrifically complex, but there's no point. We can keep it really simple. The complex is interesting from a number of perspectives. The complex is interesting because we will tend to do a practice that supports us in the place that we're at. And this is one of the difficulties that we have with any of these things. It's one of the reasons that certainly one of the local one of the local mental health charities is very against mindfulness. And the reason that they say that is because they think that mindfulness, if it's not taught well, can reinforce the symptom. It can give you the space to dwell on what's going wrong. Qigong can do the same. If you're not careful with it, you can reinforce the thing that's going on. So there's always this idea of whenever you're doing it, you're creating space. You're not doing it to fight something. You're not doing it to focus on something. Just blue sky. And that will give you the ability to create the perspective that you need. Because the same technique, especially if you look at someone, say, in the anxious state, you can use a breathing technique, you can use a mind-based technique in order to reinforce the anxious state or to let go of it. And the technique could be exactly the same. So you've got to be a little bit careful, but that's why I say blue sky. If you want a really simple idea, just out into blue sky and back. If there isn't any blue sky that day, then you can imagine it. Some people talk about expanding into the universe. When I was doing work in the Middle East, then obviously there are relationships. When you talk about blue sky, they are relating it back into the Islamic belief. When I've done work with people with a Mormon background, they will translate the blue sky into what makes sense to them. Blue sky is just blue sky. It's what makes sense to you. And you find that space within your life. Sorry, I'm on a soapbox again. Any other questions?
I have an issue that I have to live with. As mentioned earlier that I have been anxious recently, never noticed it before. Mm-hmm. But I'm 77 and I'm conscious, because they're saying it often enough, that I have a 50-50 chance of survival if I get the coronavirus. Mm-hmm. And I'm not desperately anxious, but I'm uncomfortable.
Right, okay.
And I'm thinking of my children, my two children, who I've moved into a bungalow, and they're going to have to sort all this lot out if I die. That's all right.
Yeah.
I'm not quite at peace with myself.
Yeah. I mean, I can give you the standard answer, but it sounds rather glib. Really, it's about how you hold on to the information. The information is there. The information is out there. You know, statistically, they say that at a certain age, with certain conditions, you have a lower chance of survival if you contract coronavirus. Now, if you take the practice and you make it about improving your odds or becoming better at fighting the coronavirus, the weird thing that you do is you invite the coronavirus into your practice. And we shouldn't be doing that. This is doing almost what I've just said not to do. We should be working with the idea of blue sky. What we should be doing is noticing the information that we're working with. So the 50-50 rate, and going, oh, 50-50 rate, okay, fair enough. And let it go at that point. I always like the idea that, and it was a piece that was given to me years ago about meditation. And it's, if you don't feed the thoughts, they don't keep coming. They're a bit like pigeons. If you don't feed pigeons, they don't keep coming back. So the 50-50 thought is fed by the idea of, you know, what's going to happen after that. If you can allow the thought to come up and just go, okay, it's there. But as I say, that is easier said than done. And I completely get that that's easier said than done. but that's the technique that we'd use within Qigong. And so if the thought comes up, then you can use Lachi and this idea of blue sky in order to just allow the thought to be there, but not feed it. I hope that's helpful and not too.
I'll tell you on Wednesday.
Wonderful, thank you. That doesn't give us many days to get that one sorted, does it?
or Wednesday week, yes.
Yeah, let's go with Wednesday week.
And I've got to disappear now.
Okay, thank you for your
So
time,
have I.
Martin. Thank you for your questions.
I've got to leave as well, John. Thank you so much. See you Wednesday.
Wonderful. Take care, Agnes. See you
Bye.
Wednesday.
See ya.
So can I ask what happens on Wednesday?
Wednesdays at 4 o'clock, we do a Qigong
right.
practice. And this is something that is on the Parkinson's Care and Support website.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And it's done video like this with the Zoom?
Yeah, it's on Zoom. It's in this space. And the practices that we use, it's an hour-long session. So there's a bit of conversation in there. There's some simple practice. And the practice, it's not about accurate practice. It's about just taking the idea and working with the movement. So, for example, if we have a practice that I quite often talk about, wow, that shaft of light is something else at the moment. If we talk about a practice that's like this, where we're bending down, today I can go this far, but actually it could be that tomorrow I can only get to there. And so I just work at that level. Whereas today I may work at that level, and everybody will work at whatever level they're at. So it's not about getting the movement accurate, it's about taking a posture, creating a bit of space in the body and working with that. And that just helps to, yeah, it helps to create more space in the body. It helps to take us to these places that we're talking about.
Okay. All right,
So,
thank you. So that's 4 o'clock UK time, right? Because
yeah, so
it's like 11 o'clock our time here in the States, so.
okay, so you're East Coast, yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Mhm, yeah.
Whereabouts?
Michigan.